And we want to start talking a little bit about Yemen, which of course has been much in the crosshairs of the United States, and that's only intensifying, and how to really view this question of Yemen's intervention in the overall conflict that is emanating from Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Craig Mokhiber, who's a longtime human rights lawyer. Craig, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be here, Eugene. Hi, Rania. Nice to see you both.
Well, great to have you here with us. And, I guess one of the things the issue I really wanted to raise with you here, or we wanted to raise with you, is the issue of how we're seeing what's happening with Yemen. I mean, I think the way it's being portrayed, you see often, it's sort of like there's this rogue group called the Houthis that's just randomly firing missiles into Israel, and that this is some sort of totally out of bounds behavior. But I've noticed you've been making some good points in a range of different fora about how there's actually a close connection between Yemen's actions and the actual reality of human rights law based on what rulings have been made, vis-a-vis the genocide in Gaza at the ICJ and other places. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the whole world who's been paying attention has been horrified, not just by the genocide in Palestine over the past year and a half, but by the lack of a strong and coherent response from the international community to a genocide that has been live streamed, that has been unfolding in front of our very eyes for all of these months, months after month. And you would think with this whole architecture built up since the Second World War of international law and international institutions, precisely to stop these kinds of mass atrocities, that something meaningful would have been done to stop it. But unfortunately, what we've seen instead was, one group of states like the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and some other Western states have actually joined directly in perpetrating the genocide. There's no other way to put that. They have been directly involved in the commission of these crimes on the ground alongside their ally, Israel. Then you've got another big group of Western states that have chose to be complicit in the genocide in other ways by supplying the genocide machine with fuel, with spare parts, with diplomatic cover, other things necessary to continue the genocide. Then you've got a large number of states from all regions who have chose to basically just remain silent and passive, which I have said is a breach of their international legal obligations, because all states have an affirmative obligation under international law to act to prevent and stop genocide and to enforce international humanitarian law. Most states have done nothing at all to these ends. Then you've got a fourth group of states that have opposed the Israeli regime in public statements. They've taken diplomatic action in their votes in the Security Council, in the UN General Assembly. They've joined cases in international tribunals like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. They've done that. But then there's another group, which is the smallest group, that have taken concrete steps to actively meet their obligations under international law. Remember, all states are obliged to do everything in their power to stop this genocide from continuing in Palestine. Who has actually done that? South Africa, when they brought Israel to trial in the International Court of Justice for genocide. I've said arguably Hezbollah, it's not a state, but it is a significant actor in that state, because it has engaged Israeli forces militarily, initially in territory illegally occupied by Israeli forces, the Shebaa farms in South Lebanon, to draw Israeli assets away from the genocide. And the third one that you mentioned very significantly, Yemen under Houthi control. Because, I think your viewers are more sophisticated than those watching corporate media, and they probably know that, the Houthis, Ansar Allah, they announced in response to Israel's genocide in Palestine that it would block shipping into the Red Sea that was headed to resupply the Israeli regime as long as it continues the siege and the genocide in Gaza. And it's been using this choke point at the head of the Red Sea called Bab el-Mandeb, which means the Gate of Tears, in this narrow strait between Yemen and Djibouti at the opening of the Red Sea. And they started this targeted partial blockade in November of 2023 when the genocide started by boarding an Israeli ship, and then they sustained the blockade until the announcement of the most recent so-called ceasefire. In my view, it was never a ceasefire, but the announcement of the ceasefire in Gaza. And at that moment, the Houthis lifted the blockade while the ceasefire was going on, demonstrating that they were doing this as a humanitarian intervention in order to meet what the International Court of Justice has said is the responsibility of all states, and what the General Assembly in its implementing resolution has confirmed is the responsibility of all states to do everything in their power to stop the genocide and the siege that was being imposed on Gaza. Some ships avoided the blockade by sailing around Africa, but most of them couldn't. So the major shipping companies stopped sailing to the Red Sea, and the port of Eilat in Israel went bankrupt, which means that this blockade was working. It was denying the Israeli regime many of the goods that it needed to continue the siege and to continue the genocide in Palestine. By the way, the International Court of Justice has also said that all states have international obligations to stop any supplies or trade or economy flowing to the Israeli regime that it can use in the illegal occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. So again, these are acts that are consistent with requirements of international law that have been defined by the International Court of Justice and affirmed by the UN General Assembly. And demonstrated that the intent was what they said it was when they stopped it during the ceasefire. Now they have reinstituted the blockade because Israel has returned to expedited genocide and has reimposed the siege on the people of Gaza, and so the blockade is now in force again. In response, what's happening is the United States is bombing Yemen. So in response to Yemen's effort to help to stop genocide in Palestine, the United States is bombing Yemen, a country it's been bombing for over 2 decades now. It is violating international law in doing so. There's no question when the U.S. is bombing Yemen, that's an act of aggression in international law. It's unlawful. They're slaughtering civilians in the process. This is a country which is already poor, suffering from famine and medical crisis, internal displacement. They're putting their own soldiers at risk and risking a broader regional war. They're spending billions of dollars on this bombing campaign, which could go to lifting some of the misery that the people of Yemen have been suffering from for decades now, and it's lying to its own people in the United States about what's happening, all for that one purpose, that the U.S. wants to continue to assist Israel's genocide in Palestine. Just finish by saying this is another direct act of U.S. complicity or participation in genocide. And it constitutes a crime under international law as well. We could talk a little bit more about the legal theory behind my argument that what Yemen is doing is a humanitarian intervention, but that's the big picture.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you're framing Yemen's actions as humanitarian intervention because the U.S. claims to have the right to essentially terrorize all of these countries into submission. They call it fighting terrorism. That's what the Trump administration has called it. I think even in the language that the U.S. Secretary of Defense said about Yemen, and then that Trump ended up putting out on Truth Social about Yemen, it was something along the lines of, we have to defend ourselves from Yemeni aggression or Houthi aggression against their terrorism aimed at our drones. So now they've decided that it's terrorism to shoot down American drones in their neighborhood. But meanwhile, none of these countries are ever spoken about in the sense that they have a right to self-defense, or specifically in the case of Yemen, the right to intervene against a genocide, which is what you're supposed to do. So can you talk a bit more about, 2 things. One, the argument with relation to humanitarian intervention and framing what Yemen's doing in that context as an act of humanitarian intervention. And that also can include military acts, by the way. And then the second to that is, does Yemen not have a right to defend itself? Everyone's always rattling on about Israel's right to defend itself. Does Yemen not have the right to defend itself now that the U.S. is committing acts of aggression against Yemeni civilians?
Well, Yemen absolutely has a right to defend itself. And remember, it's been under bombardment by the U.S. and the U.K. and the Saudis and others going back for a very long time now. This is not something that is new, and they have a right to defend themselves from that, which, as I said, that's an act of aggression on the part of those forces that are bombing Yemen. No question about it. They do not fall within the narrow requirements of self-defense under the UN Charter. They haven't been authorized under the Charter. And they're only claiming that these actions are, of course, they use the language of terrorism, but they justify it as essential to protect commerce. Well, protecting commerce is not in the hierarchy of international law, something that is equivalent to stopping genocide. both the International Court of Justice and the UN General Assembly have found that all countries are legally obliged to cease any support for the Israeli occupation regime, and by the way, for the Israeli genocide. They're supposed to ban products. They're supposed to cut off military, diplomatic, economic, commercial, financial investment, trade with the Israeli occupation. They're supposed to respect the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in the genocide case. They're supposed to respect their third state obligations under the Genocide Convention to stop it, and none of them are doing that. And to the contrary, what the U.S. action is doing, it is seeking to punish Yemen for trying to do what it can to stop the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And this norm in international law, the prohibition of genocide, also the right to self-determination, these in international law are called jus cogens norms, which just means they're the highest level peremptory norms from which there is no derogation. They apply to all states in all situations all the time, right? This is the highest level, stopping genocide, for example. And they are also, in legal terms, erga omnes, which means they impose obligations on all countries, right? And the GA resolution adopted under Uniting for Peace, which gives it an enhanced power, has said that all states are obliged to do these things. Now you have Yemen, which sees a grave breach of international law happening in its territorial waters and adjacent to its territorial waters. That is, the supplying of a regime that is perpetrating genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, gross and systematic violations of human rights. It sees that these ships are heading up the Gulf in order to provide the supplies necessary for Israel's crimes. And it moved to stop those violations. So in that sense, Israel is respecting those international obligations, and the U.S. is actively violating. Yemen is respecting those obligations, and the U.S. is actively violating them. And Yemen is being bombed for trying to respect them. Now, people will say, well, yeah, but Yemen doesn't. First of all, Yemen is a divided country. It basically has two governments, maybe three. And the Houthis, Ansar Allah, they control the part of the country which is adjacent to the Gulf. They control the capital of Sana'a. They control the largest amount of the population, and they have the capacity to intervene. And so they've chosen to use that capacity. The second argument is, well, they didn't get Security Council authorization. And this one is important because you're supposed to have Security Council authorization to use force, which the US does not have, by the way. But first, the Security Council has been entirely disabled by the United States throughout the genocide. The US, as a co-perpetrator of the genocide, has blocked action by the UN Security Council. And as a result, it's entirely inoperative for the purposes of the genocide in Palestine. It's just one more example of how the US is destroying the international legal system on behalf of this one oppressive foreign regime. Secondly, Yemen could argue that it's carrying out maritime law enforcement in its territorial waters, which doesn't require Security Council authorization. But even if it were said that the force that they're using doesn't fall within that law enforcement function, or someone challenged their status because of the divided government in the country, under the rules of the law of sea. By the way, the law of the sea treaty has been ratified by Yemen, but the U.S. refuses to ratify the treaty on the sea. It refuses to ratify many treaties because it acts as a rogue when it comes to international law. The Yemenis are claiming they're acting under the authority of international laws pronounced by the ICJ, reinforced by the General Assembly. And because the Security Council gets its mandate, and here's where I'm getting a little legalistic, the Security Council gets its mandate from the UN Charter. That charter is a treaty that is a part of international law. And that means the Security Council is subject to international law. It's not above it. Since both the prohibition of genocide and the right to self-determination are jus cogens rules, that means that the Security Council cannot supersede those rules in any of its actions, even if it were to take action. And if action by the Security Council can't supersede these norms, then inaction or omissions by the Council can't be said to supersede them, unless what you're saying is, unless the Security Council acts, no state is required to meet its obligations under international law to do everything in its power to stop a genocide and to enforce international humanitarian law. Now, let's say that somebody disagrees with what I'm saying, my legal assessment. The remedy for that in international law is not to bomb the Yemenis. The remedy for that is either to bring a case before the International Court of Justice, a contentious case for a dispute, and have the court decide, or get the GA, the General Assembly, to request an advisory opinion on the question. But it has no right to wage war on Yemen in this regard. So you have a conflict here in which one side is saying there's a genocide going on. All countries are supposed to do what they can to stop it. We're doing what's in our power because we are adjacent to this vital sea crossing. And we're being bombed by a country that is one of the perpetrators of the genocide. Beyond mere complicity, it is actively participating in the genocide in Palestine, using its power in the Security Council to block action. That can't be the intent of the international legal system as set up after the Second World War.
Wow. Well, that's, I have to say, a fascinating analysis. And I think, I wish it was more widely known and a very important context in terms of how people are talking about Yemen. So we really appreciate you, as always, coming to help us sort all this out. Craig Mokhiber, longtime human rights lawyer, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you both. Thanks for what you do.